Welcome, everybody. What an incredible past 2 weeks this has been, and such a turnaround in the political situation, not just in the US, but in many other countries around the world, which have taken inspiration from the huge protests in big cities, small cities, tiny towns, every state. It really is a most incredible response to the hideous murder of George Floyd, I think exactly 2 weeks ago, in Minneapolis. And I certainly wasn't expecting a response like this. I'm guessing that most of us were not in the midst of a pandemic, which is still raging across the U.S. and the world. But there has been this huge response, and for the first time in a long time, demands from the left are beginning to shape the conversation. We still have a long way to go, but one of the things that we do as socialists is analyze what has happened, what the forces are, what kinds of demands we should be making, and what strategies we should use going forward. So we're really pleased tonight to welcome Haley Pessin to give us a short talk on these issues. Haley is a member of DSA in New York City, in Queens in New York City. She's in the Socialists, the Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus in DSA. She's an experienced activist and has great insight into these questions. So we're looking forward to hear what she has to say, and then she's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, discussions, comment for about an hour. So go ahead, Haley.
All right, comrades, thank you so much for having me. I really am happy to be here with you. I want to start by acknowledging some of what Phil has already mentioned, which is just the significance of what has happened in the last 10 days. We're now in the midst of what I think we can definitively say is the biggest wave of mass protests in the United States since the 1960s. Protests have erupted in every major city in all 50 states, demanding an end to racist police brutality. And the character of these uprisings has been less like protests and much more like a rebellion, with tens of thousands of people taking to the streets, blocking highways, burning and destroying police cars, tearing down Confederate monuments, and every symbol that you can think of economic and racial oppression. In New York City alone, 47 police cars have been damaged or burned. More than 11,000 people have been arrested around the country. And in DC, of course, people will have seen that protests outside the White House temporarily forced Trump to flee and hide in his bunker. He's claiming to inspect it, and not because he was in abject fear of the rioters. The police already function as an occupying force in Black communities, and today they're responding to this uprising as if they're at war. They've sprayed tear gas and launched rubber bullets even when confronted by peaceful protesters. This week, police killed David McAddy, a 53-year-old Black restaurant owner at a protest in Louisville, Kentucky. And in New York, where I live, corrections officers killed a prisoner named Janelle Floyd, who died after being pepper sprayed in his cell. We know that the police regularly kill Black people with impunity, even when there's no social unrest, and there's little reason to believe they will stop now unless we make them. The immediate cause of this rebellion is, of course, the murder of George Floyd, who was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In death, George Floyd repeatedly gasped, "I can't breathe," the exact same words that Eric Garner spoke 6 years ago as a New York police officer choked him to death. So nothing has changed significantly in those 6 years to stop police from killing Black people with impunity, or for being more likely to see them as a threat even when they're unarmed. There have been multiple murders by racists and police over the last few months that speak to just how much Black people are targeted and treated as criminal, even when they're acting in fully ordinary ways. So Ahmaud Arbery was followed and lynched by racist vigilantes while he was out jogging. Breonna Taylor was killed by police while sleeping in her apartment. Even George Floyd was killed basically because police accused him of using counterfeit money. And there's no way to understand that except as a crime of poverty at a time when 40 million Americans have lost their jobs due to the pandemic. But these protests are not just about police brutality. They're also a reaction to the utter failure of state governments and the Trump administration to respond to the mass deaths and mass unemployment due to COVID-19. There's now an effort by both the Republicans and Democrats to reopen the economy and return to business as usual. And that's despite the fact that COVID-19 related deaths continue to rise in a third of US states. So virtually every medical expert has made it clear that if we reopen now, many more people will die. And what the ruling class has said is that is a price we're willing to pay. And that price is not being felt equally. The pandemic is disproportionately impacting Black communities in every city. In Cook County, Chicago, for example, 70% of those who have died due to COVID-19 are Black. In New York, the Bronx is the borough that has been most affected, predominantly Black borough. And that's no coincidence. The history and ongoing practices of racism have ensured that Black people are disproportionately concentrated in low-wage jobs that do not allow them to work from home and that ensure they are denied access to adequate health care. On top of these problems, racist police brutality has continued, with police violently arresting Black people for violating social distancing orders while leaving white people unharmed. But what is different today is that the protests against police brutality have been more militant and widespread than those that occurred even at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement 6 years ago. People are risking their health and defying curfews in order to attend the protests, and they continue to come out despite police repression. It reminds me of something that some of my comrades from Egypt noticed about the Egyptian revolution in 2011. They said the first step was that people lost their fear. People are at a point where it feels like we have nothing to lose. And as police repression backfires, mayors across the country have been forced into lifting the curfews. It has even forced rifts at the top of society. People will have seen the kind of, maybe a bit funny, but also remarkable fact that people like Mitt Romney are joining the protests, that the Pentagon is bucking Trump's call to shoot looters and to send in the army. And even evangelicals are coming out in defense of Black Lives Matter. It's almost like a bizarro world from the last 2 weeks, let alone the last decades. Another difference is that today's protests have been more multiracial than in 2014, although they've largely been led by young Black people as opposed to existing organizations. This is not only true for liberal cities. There are anti-racist protests happening in rural majority white towns. And according to polls, a remarkable 54% of Americans support the protests, while 74% understand Floyd's death to be a matter of racial injustice. That's a 30% jump from a similar question that was asked right after the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner at the hands of police. And that's not to mention the massive protests that are happening all over the world, from London, Japan, Australia, France, Mexico, Canada, everywhere in solidarity with protests in the US and against racism, also in their own countries. I think this speaks to how important the previous upsurge of anti-racist struggle was to delegitimizing the criminal justice system and exposing the systemic nature of police racism. While the most visible Black Lives Matter protests disappeared from the streets, we cannot underestimate the massive impact that they had in shifting political consciousness. But today's protests are going even further. They aren't just, they're also, I should say, delegitimizing the economic and political forces that enable these systems. After all, when the government responds this quickly to stop mass protests, but says they can't find the resources to fight a massive health crisis, it becomes clear that our health and safety are not really their priority. So now demands that were once only being raised by the radical left and by, in smaller circles of anti-racist activists have virtually gone mainstream. Even more remarkable is the fact that we're starting to win some of those demands and raise our horizons about what is possible. So, for example, the call to defund the police has virtually gone viral. People are calling to divert these funds towards healthcare, education, and community resources, especially in the Black communities where austerity and police violence are two sides of the same coin. Incredibly, the Minneapolis City Council has unanimously voted to disband the city's police department. I kind of didn't know that was going to be something I'd see in the next few years, much less, within 2 weeks of protest. And the fact is, if they can do it there, it raises a question: why can't we do that everywhere? We should be thinking about that. So none of this would have happened without the militancy of these widespread rebellions. I want to argue that some on the left have said that the political radicalization that we've witnessed over the last few years is primarily attributable to the 2016 presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, and that the main expression of this radicalization has been the growth of our organization, DSA. But I want to argue that these protests suggest that that radicalization actually goes much further and much deeper than either of those phenomena. By showing extreme bravery to leave their homes, risk their health, and fight for Black lives, the protests have revived militant mass action as the way to win social change. It took months before the men who killed Ahmaud Arbery were even arrested, but it only took a few days for the officer who killed George Floyd to be charged, and we know how rare that is in this utterly top-to-bottom racist criminal justice system. And that would never have happened if Black people in Minneapolis hadn't rebelled. I want to now take a step back and talk about why I think this particular struggle has been so explosive and transformative right off the bat. So there's obviously, again, been, there's a spontaneous character to the protests that we're seeing, and at the same time, they're a reflection of really decades of struggle. I think about what happened during the civil rights movement, where you had freedom rights as early as the 40s. You had legislative efforts to try to get the walls of Jim Crow to finally crack, and things did not change. And then suddenly you have the 60s, and if kids start sitting in at lunch counters, and suddenly it's like the walls of segregation just come tumbling down. I almost feel like we're in a moment like that, where it feels like what felt like intransigent systems for decades of people protesting against police brutality are now suddenly at their breaking point and are being utterly discredited. I think that the reason police killings of Black people represent the sharp edge of American racism is because they're the starkest example we have of how little Black lives matters in a society that devalues Black people at every other arena, whether it's health, whether it's the wealth gap, whether it's access to jobs and quality education. Everything that you can name is fundamentally affected by our racist and segregated society. And police racism and the criminal justice system are just the tip of the iceberg. I want to quote a young Black high schooler that I heard speaking at one of the protests I attended on Saturday. She basically said, quote, let me get this right because it was really brilliant. She said, quote, "Our ancestors were literally considered capital. This is a capital society," end quote. So racism has been built into the foundation of the United States since the very beginning. This is, of course, a country founded on the genocide of indigenous people and on the kidnapping, enslavement, and cheap forced labor of Africans. And that was the basis for the primitive accumulation of wealth that allowed capitalism to succeed as a system. Throughout its history, the US ruling class has used different systems to define non-whites as second-class citizens. It's why, despite the abolition of slavery, racism has had such staying power, whether it was through the convict lease system, the Jim Crow system, and today through mass incarceration. And that role is not simply a system of ideas. It's the most effective tool that the capitalist class has had to divide the working class in order to prevent a unified challenge to its rule. So it's not just a byproduct of capitalism. It is actually the most successful tool that they have had at every juncture of social unrest to divide our side from being able to use our strength as the majority class. So the social role that the police play is to regulate and control the most oppressed and economically deprived segments of the society, and also to reinforce and push through that second-class status and oppression of oppressed populations. And that's true whether an individual caucus is particularly racist or not. For example, although Black police officers account for only 10% of fatal police shootings, 78% of the people they kill are Black. As a protester from LA explained, the point is not about individual bad apples. I know that's probably not a big argument with this audience, but it's about the social role of the police in enforcing racism. And to quote them, it's not about whether it's a white cop or a black cop or a Mexican cop. The police don't have color. They have one color. It's blue. But because racism is so central to the functioning of capitalism, this means that resistance to racism, particularly anti-Black racism, has always had an explosive character. Wherever the Black struggle goes into motion, it has never been confined to a struggle for equal rights within the existing order. Instead, it always tends to throw up bigger questions about the entire society. It was the development of an abolitionist movement against slavery, the experience of witnessing Black soldiers fight more effectively and determinedly against the Confederacy, and the self-activity of slaves themselves to break their own chains that turned the Civil War from a war of Western expansion into a war to abolish slavery, overturning the entire economic edifice of the South. In the civil rights movement, what began as a struggle for equal rights ultimately developed into a much more radical movement that came up against the limits of simply overturning an explicit Jim Crow order, and came up against the ways that poverty, police brutality, many of the things that we're experiencing today are still reinforced despite the fact that Jim Crow segregation is over. It's why figures like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and many other figures within this movement began to draw more radical and even socialist conclusions about the need to take on economic inequality and to take on the capitalist system itself if we were to actually win Black liberation. And it's also why the ruling class has worked so hard to put the genie back in the bottle and to decimate the gains that were won during the 60s. Because not only did the Black liberation struggle inspire other Black people, it inspired other oppressed groups to fight on their own behalf in terms of the gay liberation struggle, the women's liberation struggle, any number of struggles against the war, and ultimately within the labor movement actually getting to the very edifice of the profit system itself. They don't want to see that happen again, and we got to make it happen again. So where do we go from here? There are obviously significant challenges to realizing the radical potential that this moment has thrown up for us. And I think we need to find as many spaces as possible to think that through collectively. It'll be interesting to hear what people think in this discussion. But first, I think one issue, the obvious issue, is how to make protests as safe as possible during a pandemic. Because the entire logic of protest is we are actually coming together to keep ourselves safe from police, breaking us up and kettling us and throwing us in jail, but to actually have the greatest numbers possible come out in order to be more effective. So we need to build on creative methods of protest like the car caravans and virtual rallies to amplify our physical presence in the streets and to navigate the dangers, for instance, of a possible resurgence of COVID in the fall. A second is how to navigate the ways that the ruling class has attacked these protests. There's obviously the fact that Trump himself is doubling down on positioning himself as the president of law and order. And notwithstanding the setbacks that he's faced in doing that, as I mentioned earlier, from the Pentagon and from other sections of the right, there's also another way that he's tapping into a way to divide the movement, and that is by focusing on calling Antifa a terrorist group, on basically focusing on outside agitators. That's something that the liberal media has absolutely repeated. And that's an effort to divide the so-called good, peaceful protesters from the bad, militant, destructive protesters who are destroying property or, looting or whatever. And in fact, what that actually is designed to do is to condemn all of us. So we need to reject any such efforts to attempt to divide our side. At the same time, it's unlikely that we'll be able to sustain this level of militant struggle over time. And we need to find ways to actually get organized and also to find spaces where we can better discuss and develop our tactics. There's a lot to be learned from international struggles as well, as evidenced by the militants from Hong Kong who've been tweeting out advice to Black Lives Matter protests from their own pro-democracy struggle about how to resist tear gas and outmaneuver the cops. We have to learn those lessons too. And finally, despite the nascent grassroots organizations that have formed since 2014, there remains a real vacuum of spaces where new layers of activists, particularly the Black youth who are leading in this moment, can connect with existing anti-racist organizations in order to develop a long-term strategy through the ebbs and flows of protests. This is especially important because I think we've seen the way that without independent organizations where we actually can wage our own demands, there's a danger that those demands can be watered down. So the demand to defund the police can mean any number of things, and we need to make sure that the content of it is actually geared towards breaking the power of police and beginning to think about what it would mean to ultimately abolish the police, and not toward strengthening them or just trying to reform them in piecemeal ways. We've seen the way that demands like Medicare for all or abolish ICE in the hands of different Democratic politicians have been a good way to say we support the movement and actually are in fact a setback to our side. So that's the basis for our own organization to be part of that struggle. And there have been many inspiring examples of the role that organized labor can play in this fight. In Minneapolis and New York City, I'm sure people have seen, bus drivers and their unions refused to transport arrested protesters to COVID-19 filled jails. And rank and file educators, parents and students are now leading anti-racist struggles to get the cops out of jail, the cops out of schools, which are like jails in the way that they crack down on young people of color. Ultimately, activists and labor militants must find ways to connect the labor actions against racism to the fight against a reopening that will only result in more deaths. Instead, we must insist on a humane response to the pandemic that addresses the communities most impacted by COVID-19 while taking power and funding away from the police. This goes hand in hand with the demand to make the real looters pay. We must tax the rich and insist that the country founded on genocide and slavery finally pay its due in reparations. While mainstream media fixated on incidents of looting and property destruction, we need to point to who the real looters are. The wealthiest Americans during this pandemic have collectively made $400 billion. They've made themselves $400 billion richer than they already were. At a time when 40 million people are unemployed, this only serves to highlight the greater value that this entire society puts on profit over human life. And the rebellion against racist police brutality has exposed these deadly priorities like no other force. And just to end, I want to point to what I think the role of the organized left, especially of DSA, can be in these fights, because I think we have a really essential role to play. I think it's clear that many of us are already showing up to protest. I've seen that, I'm really happy to see that you folks in Madison have already put out calls for the AFL-CIO to finally kick the police unions out of the AFL-CIO, which is an excellent development. And obviously people have been providing mutual aid. There are a lot of ways people are contributing to these protests. But given our size, there's much more I think we could be doing to facilitate the creation of national networks with existing anti-racist coalitions that are already involved in this work. And while Black comrades are already heading up this work around the country, it should not fall on the shoulders of the Afrosocialist Caucus to do this alone. We can host local and national organizing calls that are open beyond DSA and co-sponsored by other anti-racist organizations to provide space for new layers of young Black activists who are becoming leaders in these struggles to more actively shape the demands of the movement and our next steps. Most importantly, we should argue for these networks to be, again, politically independent, because in the long term, we want these to be, linked to the goal of a fully different society. And the stakes for this movement winning are high. We need to be clear. The socialist left should have one position. We would do a great disservice to both our own movement and to the struggle for Black liberation by downplaying questions of oppression, equating them with bourgeois identity politics, or suggesting the problem of this that this movement points to can just be solved by focusing on universal economic inequality. Class and race are fundamentally intertwined. We must wage a struggle specifically against oppression as well, which has been the primary way that the ruling class has been able to maintain such great levels of inequality in the first place. In this way, our role as socialists is winning the working class as a whole of all races to our collective interest in the fight against all forms of oppression. The struggle for socialism is impossible without the struggle against racism, and winning the entire class to that interest is fundamental to the struggle for Black liberation as well. I want to quote at length, a quote by the great Marxist, the great Caribbean Marxist C.L.R. James, who in 1948 laid out exactly what I think our position today must be. So I'm sorry it's a long quote, but it's really quite brilliant. All right, here we go, quote. We say, number one, that the Negro struggle, the independent Negro struggle, has a vitality and a validity of its own, that it has deep historic roots in the past of America and in present struggles. It has an organic political perspective along which it is traveling to one degree or another, and everything shows that at the present time it is traveling with great speed and vigor. We say, number two, that this independent Negro movement is able to intervene with terrific force upon the general social and political life of the nation, despite the fact that it is waged under the banner of democratic rights and is not led necessarily either by the organized labor movement or the Marxist Party. We say, number three, and this is most important, that it is able to exercise a powerful influence upon the revolutionary proletariat, that has got a great contribution to make to the development of the proletariat in the United States, and that it is in itself a constituent part of the struggle for socialism. In this way, we challenge directly any attempt to subordinate or to push to the rear the social and political significance of the independent Negro struggle for democratic rights, end quote. So comrades, we must fight in solidarity, not merely because it is a moral fight and not merely as charity, but because fundamentally our liberation is bound together. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Haley.